Welcome everybody. Welcome to ESG and Sustainability panel. I will be the moderator of this panel. My name is Birol Dindoruk. I'm a full-time professor at University of Houston, and I have been involved with this program and department more than 20 years. And until a year ago, I was the chief scientist at Shell International as a reservoir physics for reservoir physics. And we have an excellent panel members here. And what I'm gonna do is that I'm going to introduce them first, then we will go and listen to them a little bit. After that, we will have question and answer and hopefully great discussions, panel discussion over here. The first speaker will be over here is Racey or Donald Racey. He has founded Engage Energy Industrial Consulting, and Don brings a unique ability to guide organizations through significant business transformations. And he's an expert in the field of asset lifecycle management, business transformation, operational excellence, sustainability, and ESG strategy. Before founding Engage, Don served as managing director of corporate finance, turnarounds, and restructuring for FTI Consulting, headquartered in DC. Don joined FTI after serving as senior VP of operations for Reliability Management Group, Inc., RMG, based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Don has worked across the energy value chain, including upstream, midstream, downstream, oil and gas, and regulated utilities. Most of his work was focused on regulatory initiatives and primary driver of change. He holds a BA in economics and business administration from Ohio Dominican University. He is a Don is a Six Sigma Black Belt and certified project management professional. Our next speaker is Dr. Let me see. Find my document over here. Sorry about that. Our next speaker is Dr. Tura. He's a professor of geophysics and co-director of reservoir characterization project at Colorado School of Mines. His expertise is in the areas of petroleum systems, reservoir characterization and monitoring, as well as seismic methods, CO2 and sequestration, fiber optic technology, and data analytics. He is also chief scientist at Tulip Geosciences, a geosciences consulting and training company. Before this, he was geophysical senior fellow at ConocoPhillips, geophysical advisor at Chevron, and 4D subject matter expert at Shell. He has over 30 years of industry and teaching experience. He is also 2021 SEG Distinguished Lecturer. So our final panelist is Dr. Dengen Zhou. He is a Chevron Fellow and Senior Principal Reservoir Engineer at Chevron Technical Center. He has 30 plus years of academic and industry experience, including fundamental research on CO2 EOR and storage mechanisms, field development, and technology development and deployment. Recently, he has been assigned to lead subsurface technical competency development to support enterprise energy transition activities. Dengen Zhou has a PhD in chemical engineering. So after this, I'm gonna put a couple of slides right away. Then we will start with our panelists over here with their short presentations. Basically, what we are doing and what we will be dealing in this particular session is that we are going to look into and discuss a very complex system, which includes integration of energy and environment. Basically, it's equivalent of unification of many factors, and especially the human elements here. So the challenge over here is that energy itself is coupled with entire thing here. And if we look at the energy challenge, 3 S's, environmental is one part of it here. And also energy itself, coupled with the entire ecosystem here, is also a significant part of the GDP of United States, as well as the world as a whole, actually. So with that, I also want to show the following over here. As we get richer or GDP of the world increases, our emissions are also increasing. And also what is interesting here that I like to highlight is that probably it's not a wanted big mega scale social experiment. The impact of COVID indicated that when GDP went down a little bit, our CO2 emissions, therefore many factors went down. So with that, I'm gonna start with our first speaker or first panelist over here, who is Don. And I will put your slides, Don, here so that we'll get going on it. So let me know when to change.
Unmuted myself. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. If you don't mind, I always like to start off my discussions with just some basic definitions. And I wanted to kind of, in order to level set everyone. And put simply, sustainability is about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet those needs. It's a very basic concept, but I'm going to be speaking also kind of from a corporate perspective, and that's also it's the ability for corporations to maintain or enhance their ability of a company to create value over the long term. And we'll talk about how companies are doing that right now. You can go ahead if you don't mind, Doctor. Thank you. So sustainability is organized around three drivers: environmental, social, and governance. That's where we get the acronym ESG. And ESG is used by investors, asset managers, to evaluate overall corporate social responsibility, and which ensures, as the doctor said, includes ensuring the conservation of our environment, consideration for the people and communities that we serve, and the standards of running a business. So thank you. We can go to the next. So why this matters? Why does ESG matter? It's increasingly becoming a driver in business due diligence. As companies look to invest capital or to acquire another company, it is the company's ability to deliver on their ESG commitments is becoming a huge aspect of their ability to survive in the marketplace. It's becoming a condition, again, for accessing capital. There is tremendous amount around the globe of government incentives and subsidies to transition from fossil fuels to more renewable types of energy or low carbon types of energy. And it's increasingly becoming a vendor procurement requirement as part of their supply chain. So if you're a company like mine, even a service provider or professional services firm, we are often asked to provide our ESG statements as well as our commitments to reducing our carbon emissions, and stating very clearly in our documentation how we're going to go about doing that. Many companies are asking their suppliers to in turn tell them how they will be changing or transitioning their own business to a more low carbon strategy. ESG is also becoming a tremendous board of director level imperative. So if you sit on the board of a public company, or if you are an officer in a public company, there is tremendous pressure now from not only the financial community, but as well as credit rating agencies to ensure that you have an ESG strategy and policy. And more importantly, the marketplace and consumers are demanding transparency. We're seeing a tremendous shift in this regard, which I'll speak to briefly. But we're going to be talking a lot about the environmental impacts, but social justice issues are having a tremendous impact on companies' willingness and ability to transition their business models to a more low carbon business model. If you are a consumer, especially if you simple things like going to a coffee shop, they want to make sure that the ingredients that you are using are coming from environmentally friendly suppliers, that you are being socially conscious in your ability to provide a product or service. And what we're seeing that is that that consumer demand and that need for transparency is driving tremendous change in our global supply chains, especially in the manufacturing section. So as well as, you know, we're here in the United States, we're seeing this in a lot of our social justice issues, making sure that we have good policies and hiring practices around ethnicity, diversity, and inclusion, so as well as our procurement policies. In other words, we want to be sure that we are procuring our materials from countries that have good hiring practices, that we are staying away from things like forced labor and poor environmental practices, or don't have the proper safety procedures and policies in place. So that's a huge driver of change. And just my final slide. So I mentioned this a little briefly, but there are really seismic shifts in our workplace. Climate change and dramatic weather events are having a huge impact on how we go about our business. We have tremendous demographic shifts in buying behavior and consumer sentiment across the global supply chain. And more importantly, there's a new generation of investor emerging. It's been estimated that the millennial generation will put some $20 trillion just into the US economy alone that will be focused on ESG investments. And we're getting better with our technology and our data analytics, where we have improved greatly our ability to monitor emissions and monitor our carbon footprint as businesses. And then, of course, with the advent of industry frameworks that allow a company to organize their ESG disclosures and how they go about reporting has been extremely important. And we're seeing many of those industry frameworks begin to merge and work together as a group. And I think in the next year or two, we will most likely see one or two industry or global standards for ESG reporting. And of course, I speak a lot from here in the US, but our regulatory bodies are advocating for ESG disclosures. And this model is very much shifting from voluntary to mandated. So for most businesses, especially publicly traded businesses, I think they will be required over the next year or two to disclose their ESG policies and procedures and have specific frameworks that they will have to report against. So I think I always like to say, if you want to understand what's happening in an industry, follow the money. And finance is driving a tremendous amount of sustainability and ESG changes in our marketplace. So thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. This will give a great segue to our next speaker, Dr. Tura. And I will project it, and please let me know, Ali, when I need to change the slides.
Okay, I will do that. Hello, everybody. I think Don's talk was a great introduction to the big problem that we're trying to solve. I'm Professor Ali Tura from Colorado School of Mines. Next slide. So here's the summary of the problem in a nutshell. You may have seen some of this, but this is probably, if not the most important problem we have on planet Earth. It's close to being one of the most important problems we have here. The thing that's happening is that since the Industrial Revolution, we've been releasing a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. Can you see my mouse, by the way, Birol?
Not.
Okay.
Yes.
You can?
Okay, yes, I see now.
Okay, so we're basically releasing a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. So we've basically gone from the last 100, 200 years from about 250 parts per million to almost double, over 400 now, about 450 roughly. And that was necessary because it was a part of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, if you flip the switch in your house and the light goes on, or if you jump in your car and turn the key, the car starts. And these are all due to improvements we made in our lifestyles over the last 100, 200 years through the Industrial Revolution. So what's the problem? The problem is illustrated on the right-hand side. It turns out that almost on a linear trend, what we see is that the more CO2 we put in the atmosphere, the more the global temperatures rise. So this is actually a nice relationship that it's pretty straightforward, at least until now, that we made these observations is that CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, directly impacts the global temperatures. And of course, as you increase CO2 and global temperatures increase, the oceans also heat up, and you get more water vapor coming out of the ocean, and that also increases global temperatures. So there's more than one reason CO2 impacts the global temperatures. So what's the problem with this? If we go to the next slide, what we see more and more is changes in weather and climate. And this is one of the reasons this is such a big problem for mankind right now. And also because of increase in ocean temperatures, cyclone activities and hurricane activities, as we see in many of the southern United States. And just the impact from fires, in particular in Oregon, California, Colorado, obviously impacts the air quality as well. And clearly this is becoming a more and more urgent issue globally. Next slide. So being STEM majors and scientists, let's do a little bit of math here. We already said that the trend between temperature and CO2 emissions is almost linear, as you can see in the slide over here. So let's calculate how long I want it to take to get a 2 degrees centigrade rise in global temperatures, right? It's not that hard of a calculation. You go to 2 degrees on the vertical axis, drop down to the curve, and then drop down to the CO2, and you find about 3,700 gigatons of CO2 will heat planet Earth about 2 degrees centigrade. And since the Industrial Revolution, we've almost already released 2,200 of that 3,700 gigatons. So we have about 1,500 gigatons of CO2 left to stop the warming at 2 degrees centigrade. So the question to you becomes, well, how much time do I want it to take to emit a net carbon increase of 1,500 gigatons of CO2? And that impact determines what actions to take, just like a lot of global conferences going on right now to extend this timeline and limit the release of CO2 into the atmosphere. But if we do nothing, basically business as usual, that'll be about 2045, which isn't too far away. And just to put it in perspective, you know, daily your temperatures may change 10, 15 degrees centigrade from day to night. So you may think 2 degrees centigrade is not really a big deal. But during the last glacial maximum, the coldest time we had, it was only 6 degrees centigrade cooler. So in fact, 2 degrees turns out to be a pretty big deal. Next slide. So let's take a look at the future. That's kind of prediction of, you know, what's going on. If we go to a little bit more math here, if we go to business as usual, today we're putting out 40 gigatons per year of CO2 into the atmosphere. So in 50 years, 2070, that's 2,000 gigatons of CO2 that if we don't do anything will be put out in the atmosphere. And we just said we want to limit the temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade. And we said we wanted 1,500 gigatons. So if we subtract those two numbers, we have 500 gigatons of CO2 over 50 years we want to eliminate. And that's about 10 gigatons a year CO2 that we need to take out of the atmosphere for business as usual to occur, which is not going to happen, obviously. Things are going to get much better than business as usual if we do nothing, basically. So what does this 10 gigatons a year mean for you? What it means is that this is almost more than twice the total world oil production today. So we have to have a system in place to sequester or get rid of twice the oil production we have today. This is not an easy task, is what I'm trying to say. And also note that in the last 40 years, we've only stored, the whole 40 years, we've only stored 0.6 gigatons of CO2. So we haven't stored a whole lot. Our track record is not that great. So a lot of things need to change. A lot of things need to happen. And on average, if you take a utility company like a coal power plant, you know, every year it generates 0.001 gigatons a year, approximately. So if you take that number, we're looking at shutting down about 10,000 coal factories or using a technology to capture the CO2 and put it in the ground, which is what we want to talk about as earth scientists and how this would work. Now, again, what I summarized here is a business as usual or pessimistic scenario. In practice, you know, if you look at this based on the IEA, International Energy Agency, what they think is that today in 2020, we're releasing 33 gigatons. And then in 2030, with technology development, as you can see on the right over here, by the time you get to 2070, you see an arrow going down that says CO2 storage. We're looking at 6.6 gigatons of CO2 storage per year versus the 10 gigatons I was talking about. So obviously, depending on what we do now, how much CO2 is generated is going to change. And also how much CO2 sequestered is also going to be different. But you can already see that there's a big scope for sequestration in the future. Next slide, Birol. So what are these sources of greenhouse gas emissions? And basically on the left, you can see the sources of the greenhouse gas emissions by different sectors. And agriculture is pretty large. Electricity generation, like I said earlier, with coal is pretty large. And then you have transportation, and then manufacturing is also pretty large. Most of the ones that are point sources that we can capture easily are going to be manufacturing, transportation, and electricity generation, the ones in red. Electricity generation today is mostly based on coal and natural gas, as you see on the right-hand side over here. And renewables are that little gray sliver right now, which is about to change down the road. And transportation is mostly oil and gas. So what we want to do is we want to capture these sources and try to reduce the CO2 by putting it in the ground. Next slide. So as a result of this, obviously energy companies are in a state of transition. And without getting into detail of each company, it's important to note that the strategies are just simply twofold. One strategy is to reduce carbon intensity, so go to renewables and other actions like that. And CCUS would be falling into that bucket. And the other one is to expand into clean energy, which means you're either going to buy or build clean energy resources. And that's what the two axis of transformation that's going on in our industry right now. Next slide, Birol. So I want to talk here more about carbon capture, utilization, and storage, because mostly we're talking about the subsurface in this meeting. And the concept, in fact, is pretty simple. You go to a power plant, as you see on the picture on the right here. Instead of releasing the CO2 into the atmosphere, you capture it, you transport it by pipeline, and then you put it in the ground. And putting it in the ground, there's a lot of different options: saline aquifers, salt beds, old oil fields, or using it for improving recovery from existing oil fields, or putting it into coal beds. And according to the International Energy Agency, this is the only technology that can help both reduce emissions and removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's going to be a crucial part of the picture of the future. In addition to renewable energy, we're going to also need carbon capture and storage. Next slide. So now you may wonder, you know the volumes and you know a solution that can happen. You may wonder, well, what's the capacity of the subsurface to store CO2? And there's a study by the USGS that if you look at all the basins in the United States, the capacity just in the United States is 3,000 gigatons of CO2 that can be stored in the subsurface. So the volume can be pretty large. Probably the missing link today is that most of the policymakers and public are not aware how strong a CCUS solution would have in reducing global warming. And this is a very, very important point that hopefully in the future we will be able to capture and sequester a lot more CO2 in the subsurface to prevent global warming. Next slide, Birol.
Yeah, Dr. Ali, maybe we can a little bit accelerate this one.
This is the last slide.
Okay, so. Okay, great. Great.
So I just wanted to let you know that just like there's great universities out there to study these topics, University of Houston and very good universities globally, and Mines is one of them. So if you're interested in mines, look us up. Where we're selected as the #4 brainiest college in the United States. So there's my email. If you want to contact me, I'd be happy to help out. That's it, Birol. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. I see the rest were backup. Thank you.
Yeah.
Our next panelist is Dr. Dengen Zhou. And I'll project your slides here, Dengen.
Thank you, Birol, for inviting me for this event. It's
our pleasure.
It's a great pleasure to be here. And from Don and also Professor Russ presented, you say the environmental part of the social, and then you say what's the challenges of the low carbon society. I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of snapshot as an energy company, how we are acting on this transition of energy transition period. So I want to kind of share with you what we came out of lately from Chevron on the climate change resilience report. That actually show that what is our aspiration goals, what is our detailed tasks we want to do. And also I show you can see that they are structural organizational change to enable the transformation. And late, I will say, as Ali just mentioned, that CCUS is one of the major means for us to not only reduce carbon and enabling to get the net zero goals in possible is the carbon storage. I'm going to talk a little bit on that and then say, as a PE major, how we can utilize our skill set, our tools for design carbon storage. So that's kind of my goal. Next, please. So this slide came out to just cut paste from the Chevron's report. On the left, I will say there is two parts of the goals. One is limiting emission, and another is enabling the reduction. So that's the two parallel effort. And the capital allocation in the next few years, that's 7 years. Chevron going to spend $10 billion to enable carbon reduction as well as enable low carbon energy transformation. If you look down that, there's a very specific tasks for upstream and refining downstream for overall portfolio, how we're going to plan to reduce the carbon intensity. And also, if you're looking on the right side of that, there's a renewable energy, hydrogen, and then carbon capture and storage are the three major technology or business we're working on to enable the transition. In terms of reporting, like Don just mentioned that, Chevron has been voluntarily reporting all the EPA carbon footprint for all the project. So we definitely, in terms of policy, I think that's just where and also we're definitely also supporting the carbon pricing trading part of the business, so that we have a robust business model so that we will be able to act on to the needs. In order for enable those tasks, if you look in the right side, we have actually added one business line. We used to have just downstream, that's just the refinery chemicals, and the upstream, mostly hydrocarbon production. And then the midstream, the transportation, pipeline, and so forth. So if you look at that, there's a new one, we call it new energies. If you look at the solid line, we have a hydrogen, CCUS, and the third is offset and emerging. And if you look at it, with our definition, the geothermal is a part of the offsetting. So we are actually working on geothermal as well. So if you look at that, we actually have a plan, we have actually act on, and so I think with the energy company, we actually a lot of action, a lot of planning is in place already. Next, please. So, with overall, that's just the general plan for Chevron. And I'm a subsurface person. I trained as a chemical engineering, but I've been involved in hydrocarbon development for the last 30 years. So I'm mostly focused on the subsurface side. If you look at in Gorgon project, which is one of the largest carbon storage project in the industry, the project was designed to enable the Gorgon gas development. The gas contain about 10 to 15 more fraction of CO2. So in order for us to sell the gas and to separate the CO2, so how to capture and store the CO2 safely, that is the Gorgon carbon storage project. So that's been in operation for almost 2 years. Our first injection started 2019 in Australia. And so the overall design is that 3 to 4 million tons per year. That's just the design. And if you think about that amount, it's equivalent to taking off around 1 million passenger car a year. So that's kind of a scale and the impact you can think of. And overall, that project is designed to store more than 100 million tons of carbon in a saline aquifer. So yes, and in terms of the project experience, we do have industrial scale of CO2 UR, like Ali just mentioned that there's 50 years of practice of a CO2 UR in the Permian around. And now also you can see there are carbon stored in saline aquifer in practice in operation at industrial scale. Next, please. So, and the next level is to say, okay, we do have it, what's as a trained PE or in the subsurface, for example, related to what's different, how much I learned can be used for carbon storage. So I generate this slide, kind of convince myself to say we haven't learned for training and our tools for hydrocarbon production has been forming a strong foundation for carbon storage, how to characterize, how to inject, how to optimize the pressure, and so forth. So if you look at the left side of the two columns, for oil and gas production, we have exploration, appraisal, development, operation. and abandonment. We know all this, we know how to design it, how to work through that. If you're looking at the carbon storage, we need to know where. And just like Ali just shown that, you need to looking for resource before we're looking down to find the resource and we develop it. Now it's for carbon storage is where the emission is, and then you look around to say, where can I safely store it and economically? So the difference is now we are become a holder of the value to an enabler. We need to using our knowledge and the tools to support storage project that enabling for the to capture the value. So if you look at that, a lot of similarity in terms of how to characterize, how to design, and how to optimize. And there's a difference, of course. And carbon storage, you store in the place that the containment are the major uncertainty and the risks. Because, for carbon, we see the traps, but for storage in saline aquifer, for example, nature had never tested that trap. If that's reliable and so forth. How would we be able to reliably assess the containment, right? And for long-term performance, well, CO2 stay there, for hundreds of years. How we would be able to model, understand the mechanism, and for long-term performance, because all the regulatory bodies, the society want to know if you put down there, what is going to happen? How do I know it's going to be your right? And so forth. So those are the things that are going to be new. But a lot of what we have learned, the subsurface skill set are already and still be important part of the carbon storage process. So I just kind of stop here. I know there's more questions coming here. I would like to kind of answer questions in that form. We can have a more communication discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Dengen. So with this, we'll open our panel for questions and answers. Thank you very much, everybody.
So, Mariam, are you ready with the questions?
Yes. So the first question is, what is the potential of hydrogen energy as the fuel of the future?
Right. Any takers?
I can take a quick just say from what we since we went through the discussion. I think hydrogen as a part of energy form potentially going to be an important part of that, because of as a way of storing, or also if you're looking at there's a three type of so far hydrogens, the gray, the blue, and the gray, and there's a existing facilities knowledge in generating gray hydrogen that's mostly used for refineries. How we would be able to making, for example, methane be a zero emission type of that, and blue hydrogen could be a alternative. Yeah, that basically I would say we do believe hydrogen going to play a important formation of the energy in the future, and that's a different type of hydrogen going to supply. And so the K technology, what we're looking at is that, how you effectively generate it, and also how you can safely store them at a larger scale.
Yeah, and I can jump in as well. I think the main thing, I think a lot of the questions I looked at, the main thing is that the solution to energy is an integrated solution. It's not going to be just one thing. It's going to be a balance of multiple things and diverse sources of energy. So right now, with the transition, initially we started with wood, right? We were burning wood, then we went to coal, we started burning coal, and then oil and gas is the most energy source right now, in addition to partly coal. And the future is going to be a different mix. There's a mix of energy that transitions over the last, since we've been starting using energy, basically. So I would contend that hydrogen would certainly be a part of that, but there would also be other sources of energy as well. And we need to be diversified as far as energy is concerned.
I think one question that I want to ask is hydrogen energy source, or is it an energy carrier? Any answers to that?
I think that's energy. It's a form of energy that you can generate it. It's different form and how to deliver to the application side, right? But also there are natural production of hydrogen somewhere in Australia, right?
Yes, there are a couple of natural, resources of it.
Okay, thank you. Now the second question is that based on the optimistic vision about the carbon capture, storage, and utilization, what are the main challenges of CO2 storage in depleted reservoirs?
I can probably say something about that, but the last part is, what are the challenges and what?
Of CO2 storage in depleted reservoirs.
Oh, well, as I showed earlier in the numbers, depleted reservoirs would be only a very small part of the solution because, as we said, we need gigatons of storage, and there's just not a lot of depleted reservoirs that can handle, gigatons of storage. So it would be certainly a part of the solution. In fact, in the United States, most of these projects are looking into storage into existing old produced reservoirs. So I think in terms of the CCUS, the main thing that's kind of missing is the informing the public and policymakers that CCUS is a appropriate and good solution to help with this problem. And the main bottleneck with CCUS, with many things like this, is cost. I think the technology, all of us working in the subsurface for a very long time, we have very well developed technology on how to put things in the ground or take things out of the ground. And so technically, I see less of a challenge. I see more of a challenge in terms of the cost of, in particular, capturing technology, because it's expensive to build a facility to capture CO2 from an existing plant. And for that to happen, you're going to need some form of incentives, and that's what a lot of people are working on.
Maybe I just adding on to what I just saying that definitely the business model is one thing, right? It's how to value of the carbon. That's definitely one. In terms pure down to the technical for depleted oil reservoirs, I think that's two things. One is that the number of wells we have, it depends on how intensive we draw the wells. The existing wells are how to repurpose those wells. That's the cost. And that's definitely part of the how we can reliably assess, because all the field can be 70, 80, 50 years of old. Wells drilled different time, different vintages and so forth. So, understanding how to mitigate those wells, it's the one safety. Another one is when you deplete the reservoir, we have different drivers when we produce the hydrocarbon. So how much of that volume can we really access to it? After we deplete it, depends on its very high pressure and so forth. So those are another one that I would look into say is how we can assess the accessibility of the pore volume. We know how much we produce, but we may not know how much we can really feel impact. So that's kind of, looking technically, those are the ones I would put time and to figure out when we develop in the field. developing a project in the depleted reservoirs. Thanks.
Yeah, I think maybe one thing that can be added to that is, as Dengen pointed out, the wells you use for oil and gas production are not necessarily the same wells you use to sequester CO2, because CO2 wells have to last, hundreds to thousands of years. So there's much more heavier requirements for those type of wells, which would also mix into the economical calculations to make sequestration safe in the long run.
So what are the environmental impacts of capturing and storing this carbon?
Well, again, I don't think there are any environmental impacts. We're basically building a facility to capture, so there's really no environmental impact from that side, I would think. And then you're pipelining it, so the only thing could be, if you burst a pipeline or something, that could have some impact, so you'd have to take appropriate cautions. And then when you're putting it in the subsurface, like Dengen mentioned, probably the biggest risk would be older wells in the places you're putting CO2. That could be a permeability transport to reach to the surface. So you have to be very careful about where you're putting the CO2 and making sure there's no conduits to the surface. But other than that, I think it's a very safe practice.
Okay, so another question is that what is the potential of exploiting gas hydrates resources for reducing emissions?
Mariam, can you repeat that?
What is the potential of exploiting gas hydrate resources for reducing emissions?
I think gas hydrates are dangerous. Gas hydrates will become unstable as the globe heats. So as temperatures rise, a lot of gas hydrates is stored under permafrost. And if the permafrost starts to melt, you'll be releasing gas hydrates into the atmosphere, which will further enhance substantially the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and global warming. So I don't think that would be something that we want to do, and it's potentially a very serious risk down the road.
Okay, so another question is that can renewable energy such as solar energy be utilized to explore hydrocarbon resources?
Would you mind repeating that again, please?
Can renewable energy such as solar energy be used to explore hydrocarbon resources?
Well, I mean, I can jump in if someone wants to jump in, that's fine. But I would say that that wouldn't really solve a whole lot of things. It wouldn't really make much of an impact. If I understand the question correctly, it really wouldn't make much of an impact in terms of the amount of CO2 that's being released into the atmosphere. So we should use best practices, obviously, and reduce our CO2 footprint. But there's a lot of other higher order terms in this equation that need to be addressed, I would think.
But also, I would like to add on that if you can use solar energy for your operations, why not, right? That's what I was saying. That, for example, in California, to look into see if they can preheat some of the steams they need in order to generate that. If you can, as a project, be able to effectively using the solar energy, I think that's fair. I think that it just have to be a effective usage of the energy that generated.
Yeah, there's always the subject of energy density when we speak about renewables and their intermittent sources. So I live in Western Pennsylvania for the audience's benefit, and we have more cloudy days than Seattle. So it's one of those things where solar doesn't always make a lot of sense, and neither does wind, depending on the geography that you live in, as well as the sheer amount of real estate that it takes to, say, offset the energy produced by a nuclear power plant or a traditional coal-fired power plant. It creates its own set of issues from an environmental perspective.
Indeed,
Okay.
we pay premium for the reliability. In fact,
that is
the
correct.
entire thing runs on trust, in quotes.
Okay, thank you. Now our last question is that what is the current strategy for energy transition?
Well, I think we're starting to see for instance, with the conference that just ended last week in Glasgow, we're beginning to see a more coordinated effort across the globe in this respect. It's still very much a country and even a local issue. There is no worldwide coordinated effort on this. And there are so many different variables that have that are in play in this regard. But I think that when we begin to, at least at the corporate level, when we begin to having some standard frameworks for reporting ESG related disclosures, I think that's one step, but there does need to be more of a concerted effort at, kind of the United Nations level, I would think, to make some real significant progress.
Yeah, one thing I can say is that if you're interested in this question, you can look at the BP 2021 Outlook report, and they cover 3 scenarios for the future. One is business as usual, the other is net zero, and the third one is gradual decline, basically. And most of the scenarios basically say that coal will be substantially reduced. Oil will stay about the same and slightly reduced. Natural gas will be increased or more transition into natural gas. And of course, the big chunk of the pie is going to be renewables, like solar and wind, which will be increasing in the future.
Was it the last question?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to put a couple of liners over here based on what I learned from questions and our panelists. One of the interesting thing is that, follow the money in terms of ESG. And another thing is that license to operate is going to be even beyond the borders. And the CO2 is a progressive in terms of global warming because it increases other factors like vapor, etc. in the air. And also the energy ecosystem is extremely complex, and we still don't or did not make a big dent on it in terms of how much we sequester. And I think one of the outstanding questions is that for this global challenge, who's going to pay the bill? That's all I took as the learnings out of this. Please add if you have any other headliners for it. Thank you.